seasonal wetlands during which wet rice is cultivated. So the huge loss of rice production. Yes?
Excuse me. Have you taken into account ocean level rises?
Yeah.
From 18 centimeters over a meter will, that's maximum actually really close to the whole lower Mekong and Vietnam.
Yeah, there's a message here that I didn't deliver, but basically hydropower dams will make worse whatever happens with climate change or climate variation, rising sea levels. So,
the combination of the sinking delta as well.
The sinking delta and
there's no building up in the section, just
yeah. So we'll accelerate that. And also there's a risk that because of the snow melt, shrinking snow cap in Tibet, the winter snow cap, and which melts during the summer provides river water, and the retreat glaciers, that in 25 years there may not be enough water in the river even to operate China's system up in So you're kind of building a white elephant if the worst estimates come to pass.
So the map you showed of different planned dams or project dams, are these already sites that have been found? Are they locations that have been determined? Are they fund projects? Or are these all?
These are all well known because, ironically, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and Corps of Engineers in the early Cold War period came up with this scheme to create industrial giant EVA in the Mekong River. And two things. The main thing that interfered was the Vietnam War. And then the other thing, though, that affected them was that in northern Laos, there was a dam called Pamong Dam that would have had a reservoir big enough to keep all this stuff working. Nobody was even thinking about China at that time. That was like a back end of your arm. So they needed to have a big dam in northern Laos to keep all this working during the dry season. But the problem was, even then, it would have been inundated 300,000 people. Today, many more, many times that would be affected. So it became politically impossible to build that dam. And also, as I mentioned, the Thai environmental movement, well, that came along later. But the main point is, even then, it was politically not feasible. But the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation at that time was they didn't even have an environment in their lexicon. No one, they thought about this as fun. They never thought about the ecology of the river and how it functions. Yes?
Has there been a shift over time in the attitude by China towards the Mekong River Commission? Is it a member yet? I mean, did it shift after the Lower Mekong Initiative?
See, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. China is an observer, as is Burma and Myanmar, as you please. And for a long time, though, it provided almost no information. And then several years ago, it agreed to provide flood season readings of the water level in certain points in the river. This year, though, this winter, which was their dry season, late winter, they had really severe drought in the river, like worse than 50 years. And people downstream are saying, China, it's that new big dam you built that's the cause. And China's saying, no, we're dry too, it's not us. But the fact is, there was no transparency. So was China filling or spilling? Or was it letting everything pass through that came down the river? So recently they invited a number of regional leaders, all regional leaders, to come to China to do it on, I think, to look at the Shalwat Dam. But this would not only happen after the U.S. launched the Lower Mekong Initiative. And so one of the interesting things about this Lower Mekong Initiative, which we don't have time to describe, but is that both that initiative and also Secretary of State Clinton's statements in Southeast Asia at the ASEAN meeting this year and otherwise about how the U.S. thinks territorial disputes and maritime disputes should be handled, which has to do with China's claiming the whole thing in historical sea and the law of the sea having different principles. But the main point is, in both the South China Sea and in the Mekong, mere fact that the U.S. said we're coming back, we're getting re-involved with Southeast Asia and Austria, caused the Chinese, they were livid about it. They are livid still, but it caused them to say, well, I guess we better pay a little more attention to our neighbors. So in that sense, it's having a positive impact. Even though there's not a whole lot behind it right now in terms of money. Yeah.
This is one giant watershed.
Right.
So what's the science program behind understanding the watershed and all the dynamics involved? From the snow that falls in the mountains there.
Yeah, well, right now it sort of sits, the Mekong River Commission is tasked with that. So they've been asked, and that was actually their initial function, was to provide sort of an advisory role and have representatives from the governments who are members. But the idea was to combine the best understanding and awareness of these different trade-offs and then make recommendations and get their country governments behind them. So there is an amazing amount of data that's been gathered, but it tends to still be a bit piecemeal. It doesn't, for example, it can't include the China portion, which is what we're going to get.
But it makes an assumption about the China
It makes an
portion.
assumption, but we don't know anything about the real data. And that's a really key point for this issue you mentioned about, was there a drought this year, or was it the fact that all the water is being stored by the dam? But there are other efforts. The USGS just put together something called the Dragon Initiative, which is deliberately brought together all of these different institutions working in the Mekong Delta to try and understand who has what data sets, what are the limitations, what do we have beyond what the MRC has provided, because they're a bit hamstrung since they don't have complete membership, and they're not as well funded as they need to be. So that's another really good example of how the U.S. government is really trying to stand behind this and provide a lot better data.
This initiative, actually, this Lower Mekong initiative, started in the last year of the Bush administration, sort of with a Mississippi Mekong partnership that we established with the Continental University in the Mekong Delta. So that was done primarily with regard to climate change issues, climate change adaptation issues. Now they realize that the database they have to do studies of what happened with climate change in different ways, sea level rises, rainfall, etc. That data is really no good. It's historical data. Once these dams are put up, the whole database changes. Starting from the whole.
So there are ongoing programs that analyze like water flows and.
Yeah, so for example, we just got a grant, Conservation International, a small role to play in this with the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and they're asking that exact question: what are the trade-offs between climate-induced variation of rainfall patterns and flows linked to dam development? Because the two are going to counterbalance each other in really interesting ways. And the current MRC Strategic Environmental Impact Assessment Report doesn't really address this. They view the two as separate levers. But there's going to be an interaction there that could completely tip this balance in terms of issues.
By the way, the MRC did complete this called Strategic Environmental Assessment basin-wide and made assumptions that China would build on dams, and then they looked at the impact of the Lower Mekong dams. And the number one recommendation of this report, which was done for the MRC, not by the MRC, was a 10-year moratorium on any dams on the Lower Mekong. And I believe the Secretary of State Clinton called for that when she was last.
She called for a pause. We felt like moratorium was a little too strong to state.
10-year pause is a long pause. Anyway, and that's needed because you've got a report done by a bunch of really prominent, well-respected consultants that is, not to pun intended, I guess, is damning about the whole idea of the Main Street dams. Yes, sir.
How many dams are planned on the upstream portion of the Mekong? I mean, is it 8 to 10 or 20 to 30? And are there statements or clauses on that development?
Well, there are literally more than 200 dams that are existing or being planned. for the tributaries, particularly in the highlands of Laos and central highlands of Vietnam. But go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just asking Tim, my understanding is that there's somewhere between 10 and 14 on the main stem, but it gets more difficult when you look at tributaries. But the main stem are the ones that are going to dramatically reverse flow. So the point where you're going to
They're the ones that are going to reduce the flow.
yeah, the 70% of fisheries loss.
It's also the question mark lies in what China's doing up in Tibet on the Monsong, as they call the Mekong. We've spoken to people who have actually been up there, notably a photographer, and he's seen the projects, but there's so little information available. So what we know are the 8 in Yunnan. But then what they're doing even further up in Tibet is not, it's not clear.
And that would have a direct impact on flows throughout the basin.
Now these lower Mekong dams, by and large, will not change the flow of the river that much compared to these. Here they're going to change the whole seasonal pattern of wet and dry. But what they do is they block fisheries migration, and they will inundate temporary wetlands or seasonal wetlands. So a devastating effect on fisheries and agriculture.
Are there other environmental implications for these altered water flows other than the delta and the lake that you talked about? I mean, what about throughout the main stem? Other concerns?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have this, the one that you mentioned earlier, the disruption of the sediment. So it's not only in the delta, but further upstream that becomes a reverse problem. You have this massive sediment buildup.
Yeah.
They've already shown, history has shown again and again, that if you stop this flow, the amount of costs for dredging are astronomical. And usually what happens is the poor country government repairs those. So it allows them to inherit some of those costs, certainly Cambodia, of even doing the basic maintenance.
The first Chinese dam that came online in Manhuan has been studied, the effects on siltation. And in northern Laos, they've seen as much as a 30% reduction in silt just from one large, if not mega-sized dam. Yes? Take over.
Is this a part of a broader effort by the U.S. government or by the State Department to kind of highlight the impact of basically industrial development on the environment and how it's going to have like these geopolitical, whatever you want to call it? Is this just one of many initiatives that's underway?
Kim and I did have several meetings, South Asians around Washington, where State Department people were present, and the Reader Bureau people came up with this idea, basically said, look, this is the president of Chinese Ronald Tide of diplomats. It is geopolitical. And the ties we talked to, they're more into it. Of course it's geopolitical. I mean, everyone understands that China understands. No one in any doubt is geopolitical. And by and large, it's interesting that apart from China, no one has a problem. None of those countries, even Laos and Cambodia, do not have a problem. The counterbalance effect, or the sort of effect of the U.S. sort of, we're not going to get involved like the Chinese are, in terms of aid and development, but the mere fact that the U.S. is there, we can provide technical support, we can give them capacity building, a lot of things, transfer technology, a lot of things we can do. And the main thing is that they feel more comfortable that China isn't just the big, always mixed metaphors, but China is by itself and is such a huge and powerful country compared to their neighbors that
I think there are some, maybe not region-specific examples, but there's certainly trends. So Sarah and I, Sarah Davidson, GNC earlier, have been talking a lot with USAID, who's revamping their entire water strategy, and they just put together something called a water results framework, with the very idea in mind that we need to think more broadly about how water is managed and how it links to these other things like food security, buffering against the impacts of climate and radiation change, and what are the ways to manage these larger landscapes that might be a bit better for all of us. So I think there are some other trends that we're seeing that pick up kind of these complicated links between the environment and basically human life.
I think this is your views on kind of the role
Yeah.
Because that comes with
Thank you.
definitions
Yes.
and like more direct.
China now has half the voting power on the board of the ADB as Japan and the United States have. China is also still a big recipient of ADB funds. So China plays a major role, and particularly with something called the Greater Mekong Subregion Project that you know about the Asian Development Bank. And they're basically building roads and bridges all over across the Mekong, north, south, east, west, the Mekong Basin. But China would not let the water be part of the GMS. So they built the roads, and they're even building a regional power grid, which will hook up to any country that puts a dam. But they don't, China would not allow them to coordinate what's happening on the ground with what's happening on the roof. And so that's something that the U.S. has been pretty quiet about all this for many years. And so I think you'll see a change, at least in terms of how the U.S. pays more attention and has more to say about these issues. We've been kind of out to lunch for a long time.
Are the Chinese hydropower companies involved in dam construction?
Yeah, they're the big.
Mekong?
Yeah, they're the big driver. Oh, in the Mekong, the lower Mekong, yeah.
Yeah.
About half of the projects would be Chinese developers. The others are Thai, Malaysia. I guess Vietnamese, one Vietnamese company.
Yes.
Would be Vietnamese. You know. The other with Vietnamese is, they're torn in different ways because they're at the end of the line, so they get whatever comes down or doesn't come down through. At the same time, they are concerned about China's, growing influence in Laos and Cambodia. So this dam that they want to support in northern Laos could also be seen as a foreign policy thing. In other words, they're trying to be a player in regional development as well as a country concerned about the damage.
There's also a little bit of sort of brinksmanship going on, where Vietnam doesn't want to do what may be in its best interest and pull out of its agreement to fund this project for fear of missing the boat, for fear of someone else stepping in and not only getting the big project, getting the big money, and the electricity. There were some recent government statements calling on actually one of our partners in Vietnam, a Vietnamese NGO, held in Hanoi. So, they're very split. They don't know whether they should pursue this project for the economic value, but then suffer the big consequences.
Contribute anyway to the consequences, yeah. I should mention, by the way, Stimson Center has a website. I've got a card with it if you want it, but basically, the Southeast Asia program has its own website, and we have a report called Mekong Tipping Point, same title as my presentation, and we also have a 9-minute documentary video on